It began in a humid, dimly lit basement in a city that officially did not exist before the 19th century. I found a map, not a digital reconstruction, not a high-resolution scan from a university database, but a physical relic printed on vellum that felt more like skin than paper. It was tucked behind a false backing in a trunk belonging to a man whose estate had been liquidated by the state under circumstances that remain, even now, suspiciously vague. On this map, the vast expanse of northern Asia, what we are told was a desolate wasteland of nomadic tribes and frozen tundra, was labelled with a single defiant word: Tartaria. It was not a regional descriptor. It was not a synonym for the Mongol Empire. It was depicted as a sovereign entity with its own heraldry, its own borders, and its own infrastructure. I touched the ink and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air of the cellar. This was the first anomaly, a small, singular puncture in the fabric of accepted history. Ask yourself why a cartographer in 1754 would invent a kingdom larger than Europe. Ask yourself why every modern textbook has scrubbed its name from the record. This is not a clerical error. This is not the natural evolution of geopolitical nomenclature. This is erasure. It is a deliberate, systematic removal of a global power from the collective consciousness of humanity. I spent weeks staring at that map, comparing it to the sanitized versions provided by the National Archives. The differences were not subtle. Where the modern maps showed empty space, the vellum showed cities. Where we are told there was only primitive migration, the vellum showed complex trade routes. I began to realize that I wasn't just looking at an old map. I was looking at a crime scene. The victim was a civilization. The weapon was the pen of the institutional gatekeeper. I stepped out of that basement and into a world that suddenly felt like a stage set. Every neoclassical building, every star fort, every massive stone cathedral began to whisper a different story. Not the story of the pioneers, not the story of the colonial empires, something else. What if the history we inherit is merely a convenient fiction designed to hide a global inheritance? To understand the scale of the disappearance, one must first look at the architectural anomalies that span the globe. I found myself in San Francisco, standing before the Palace of Fine Arts. We are told it was built for the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. We are told it was constructed from plaster and burlap, intended to be temporary, but look at the load distribution. Study the precision of the Corinthian columns. Ask yourself why a civilization struggling with basic sanitation and horse-drawn transport would expend such immense energy on a temporary structure of such mathematical perfection. It makes no sense. Not the timeline, not the logistics, not the labor. It is a recurring pattern. From the World's Fairs of Chicago to the grand exhibitions of Paris and St. Louis, we see the same phenomenon. Massive Greco-Roman cities appearing out of nowhere, only to be demolished immediately after the gates closed. They tell us these were Stafford buildings built for show. I tell you, they were the remains of something older. They were the reclaimed husks of a previous epoch, repurposed by the victors of a forgotten conflict to serve as a backdrop for their new narrative. The sheer scale of the construction is physically impossible for the era's documented technology. We are looking at a global architectural language that predates the national borders we recognize today. This is the global pattern. Whether you are in Vladivostok, Buenos Aires, or Melbourne, the old government buildings all share the same DNA. High ceilings, arched windows, and a sophisticated understanding of acoustics and atmospheric energy that we have since lost. It is as if a single, unified culture once spanned the entire earth, and the powers that be spent the 19th century whitewashing its existence. They didn't build these cities. They found them. They moved in, renamed the streets, and told us they laid the first stone. It is a lie so large it becomes invisible. The trail led me from the ruins of the World's Fairs to the vaults of the Vatican and the basement archives of the British Museum. I began to track the cartographers themselves. Who were the men who drew the world before the Great Reset? I found the records of Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius, but more importantly, I found the men who came after them, the ones tasked with the corrections. In the late 18th century, there was a sudden coordinated effort to standardize global geography. It was a period of intense institutional gatekeeping. Documents from the French Academy of Sciences reveal a series of directives issued to explorers: ignore the ruins, rename the provinces, and classify all evidence of advanced metallurgy in the East as anecdotal. I found a letter from a disgraced surveyor in 1812 who wrote of finding cities in the heart of the Gobi Desert that were built with a precision that rivaled London. His report was suppressed. He was committed to an asylum. His maps were burned. This is how the erasure works. It is not just about burning books. It is about delegitimizing the observer. If you see something that contradicts the narrative, you are mad. If you find an artifact that shouldn't exist, it is a hoax. Ask yourself who benefits from a world without a past. If you can convince a people that they were once primitives who slowly crawled toward progress, you can control their future. But if they knew they were the survivors of a fallen high-tech civilization, they might start asking where the energy went. They might start looking at the copper domes of our old state houses, not as decorative ornaments, but as functional components of a lost power grid. The Tartarian Empire wasn't just a political rival, it was a technological one. Its existence threatened the monopoly of the emerging industrial barons who sought to sell us the very resources we once pulled from the air. Not coal, not oil. Something else. I began to investigate the mud flood. It is a term used by fringe researchers to describe a strange geological consistency found in nearly every 19th century city. Look at the windows of the oldest buildings in your town. They are half submerged in the earth. These are not basement windows designed for light. They are full-size portals that have been buried by a sudden, catastrophic influx of sediment. The official explanation is pavement raising or architectural style. But why would every architect on the planet simultaneously decide to build their ground floors 6 feet underground? Why is there a visible layer of silt and clay in the soil strata of urban centres across the globe, dated precisely to the mid-1800s? I travelled to Rome, to London, to Seattle. I saw the same thing everywhere. The first floor is actually the second. Below the street level lies a buried world. In the archives of the Smithsonian, I found mentions of massive excavation projects in the 1870s where hundreds of thousands of tons of debris were removed from cities like Washington, D.C. to uncover the streets. They didn't build the Capitol from scratch. They dug it out. This event, the Great Inundation, is the missing link. It provided the perfect cover for the institutional erasure. In the chaos of the catastrophe, the old world was buried, and the new world's architects stepped in to claim the unoccupied territory. They found the grand stone buildings already there, cleaned the mud from the foyers, and declared themselves the masters of the new age. The pioneers were actually scavengers. The founding fathers were the administrators of a global salvage operation. What if the history of the United States is not a story of expansion, but a story of recolonization. The more I looked, the more I saw the fingerprints of a global cover-up. I began to focus on the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were shipped from the east coast of the United States to the west. We are told they were the children of poor immigrants, but the records are suspiciously incomplete. At the same time, massive insane asylums were being built in every state, structures that looked like palaces, capable of housing thousands. Ask yourself where the adults went. If a catastrophe had wiped out the previous generation, leaving behind a world of grand architecture and abandoned technology, the most efficient way to reset history would be to remove the parents and indoctrinate the children. The orphan trains were a demographic reshuffling. The asylums were not for the sick, they were for the dissenters, the ones who remembered the world before the mud. It is a chillingly logical system of institutional gatekeeping. You silence the witnesses and rewrite the curriculum for the survivors. By the time those orphans grew up, the grand buildings they lived among were presented as new constructions. The maps of Tartaria had been replaced by maps of Russia and China. The heraldry of the griffin and the owl had been replaced by the eagle and the lion. I found a photograph from 1860 of a city in the Midwest, supposedly founded only 5 years prior, that featured paved streets, gas lighting, and stone edifices that would take decades to build even today. The streets were empty. No people, no horses, just a silent stone ghost of a city waiting for its new inhabitants to arrive on a train. It was not a birth, it was an inheritance. I turned my attention to the concept of free energy. If Tartaria existed as a global empire, how did it function? I looked at the spires of the old world, the cathedrals, the mosques, the pagodas. They all share a common feature, a metallic finial, often gold-plated, connected to a sophisticated network of copper wiring and rose windows. In pseudo-academic circles, these are called religious symbols, but look at them through the lens of electrical engineering. They are antennas. They are resonators. I found a series of patents from the early 20th century that were based on atmospheric electricity, the idea that the ionosphere is a massive battery that can be tapped for limitless power. Nikola Tesla was not a lone genius, he was a translator. He was trying to rediscover the science of the Tartarian world before he was shut down by J.P. Morgan. The Great Reset of the 19th century wasn't just about borders, it was about the transition from free, decentralized energy to a metered, centralized system of control. The destruction of the Tartarian maps coincided with the dismantling of the global energy grid. The massive cathedrals were repurposed as houses of worship to hide their true function as power stations. The organ was not for music but for frequency modulation. The bells were not for marking time but for vibrating the local ether to maintain a specific energetic state in the population. It is a total inversion of reality. Everything we are told is spiritual was once technological. Everything we are told is ornamental was once functional. We are living in the ruins of a high-tech paradise, and we are paying a monthly bill to the people who broke it. The erasure required a new type of scholar. I began to track the rise of the modern historical establishment. In the late 1800s, organizations like the American Historical Association and the Royal Geographical Society began to consolidate power. They created a peer review system that effectively barred any mention of a pre-cataclysmic global civilization. I found evidence of a massive book purge in the 1890s. Librarians were instructed to remove maps and texts that referenced Tartaria or Greater Scythia. They were replaced with narratives of linear progress. This is the core of the institutional gatekeeping, the enforcement of the timeline. If you control the timeline, you control the perception of what is possible. By lengthening the Middle Ages and inventing the Renaissance, they created a buffer zone that pushed the memory of the previous global empire into the realm of myth. They turned Tartaria into a ghost. I contacted a retired cartographer who had worked for a major intelligence agency in the 1970s. He told me, under condition of anonymity, that even today, satellite imagery of certain regions in Siberia and the Gobi Desert is digitally altered. There are structures out there, massive hexagonal cities and pyramidal complexes that do not appear on Google Earth. We are told to remove them, he said, not because they are a threat to national security, but because they are a threat to the story. What if the world is not what we see, but what we are allowed to see? I travelled to the heart of the forbidden zone, the plains of Central Asia. I didn't go as a tourist. I went as an urban explorer of the wilderness. I found what the maps tried to hide. I found stone foundations that stretched for miles, half buried in the permafrost. These were not the remains of yurts or nomadic camps. They were the footprints of industrial complexes. I found evidence of star forts in places where no European army had ever set foot. Star forts are perhaps the most damning evidence of the global pattern. They are perfectly symmetrical, geometrically complex bastions found on every continent. We are told they were built for cannon warfare, but their design is nonsensical for defence. They are, however, perfect for frequency resonance and water management. They are integrated into the Earth itself, functioning as nodes in a planetary circuit. The institutional gatekeepers call them Vauban forts, attributing them all to a single French engineer. But how could one man design thousands of identical structures from Japan to North America to the Siberian wastes? He couldn't. Not this man. Not that empire. Something else. The star forts are the anchors of the Tartarian grid. They were the stabilizers of the old world's climate and energy, and they are being systematically destroyed. Even now, in the name of urban development, these ancient nodes are being leveled. If you can destroy the physical anchors of the old world, you can finally sever the connection to the past. The sense of tension began to weigh on me. I realized that the investigation was not just an academic exercise. There is a reason the tone of our modern world is so somber, so unsettled. We are living in a house we don't own, speaking a language that has been stripped of its power. I found a diary of a woman from the 1880s who lived through the repopulation of a city in the Midwest. She wrote about the hollow feeling of moving into a mansion that was already furnished, already equipped with strange wireless lamps that the new authorities quickly replaced with kerosene. She wrote about the hushed whispers of the elders who were taken to the asylums. She knew. She saw the erasure in real time. This is the forbidden knowledge that the skeptics dismiss as fantasy. But ask yourself, why does the 19th century feel like such a frantic, desperate attempt to build a new identity? The sudden explosion of flags, anthems, and nationalistic fervour was a distraction. It was a way to give the orphans a sense of belonging so they wouldn't look too closely at the buried ruins beneath their feet. We are a species with amnesia, and our doctors are the ones who gave us the blow to the head. The institutional gatekeeping is not just about history, it is about the suppression of human potential. If we knew what we were capable of, if we knew that we once had free energy, global peace, and a unified science, the current systems of control would collapse overnight. I am left with a series of unresolved loops. I look at the maps and I see the gaps where the truth used to be. The cartographers who were told to remove Tartaria were successful, but they were not perfect. They left behind the architecture. They left behind the star forts. They left behind the half-buried windows. I am standing on a street corner in a city that I now realise is a reclaimed ruin. I look at the people passing by, and I wonder how many of them feel it too, that nagging sense that something is missing, that feeling that we are playing a game with a stacked deck. The investigation doesn't end here. It can't, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You begin to look at every historical monument with suspicion. You begin to question every scientific breakthrough that conveniently relies on a finite resource. What if the darkness of the past was actually a blinding light that we were forced to turn away from? What if the progress we celebrate is actually a slow, controlled descent? I leave you with this. The next time you see an old building with its windows sunk into the earth, don't ask why the ground is so high. Ask what is buried beneath it. Ask who told you to stop looking, and ask yourself, if they can hide an entire empire, what else are they hiding right in front of your eyes? The loop remains open. The ink is still wet on the new maps, but the old ones, the ones that remember, are still out there, waiting to be found in the basements of the world. I began to look at the water, not as a resource, but as a conductor. The star forts of the 17th and 18th centuries were almost always situated at the confluence of major river systems or on the jagged edges of coastlines. The official military histories claim these were strategic vantage points for naval defence, yet many of these fortifications feature intricate fractal-like moats that serve no practical purpose in a siege. In fact, many were built in depressions where an enemy could easily fire down into them. This is the structural anomaly that the Academy refuses to address. If you look at the floor plans of these bastions, the Bourtange in the Netherlands, the Neuf-Brazach in France, or the forgotten masonry of Fort Jefferson in the Gulf, they resemble nothing so much as modern circuit boards or the Chladni patterns formed by sound frequencies on a vibrating plate. Ask yourself why a military engineer would prioritize aesthetic symmetry over tactical utility. What if these were not forts at all? What if they were acoustic stabilizers that are designed to harvest the kinetic energy of flowing water and convert it into a localized electromagnetic field? I found a fragmented ledger from a Dutch surveyor dated 1712 that described the humming of the walls during a high tide. He wrote that the air within the star's centre felt thick with vitality, and that the crops within a 10-mile radius grew to twice their normal size. This report was not archived in a botanical library. It was seized by the East India Company and classified as a matter of state security. This is the institutional erasure in its most crystalline form. They took a global network of life-sustaining resonators and rebranded them as instruments of war. They replaced the hum with the crack of gunpowder, effectively masking the original purpose of the structures. By the time the Great Reset was complete, the world believed these star-shaped monuments were built to kill rather than to heal. It is a profound psychological inversion. It turns a cathedral of energy into a tomb of history. The investigation into water led me to the great canals of the 19th century. We are taught that the Erie Canal and the massive waterways of Russia were dug by hand by men with shovels and wheelbarrows, moving millions of tons of earth in impossible timeframes. In the case of the Erie Canal, the narrative claims it was completed in 8 years by unskilled labourers. Yet, when you examine the stone locks and the precision of the masonry, you see a level of hydraulic engineering that surpasses the capabilities of the era. I found photographs from the 1850s showing these canals already weathered, already ancient, with massive trees growing through the stone embankments. They weren't digging new channels, they were clearing out the silted up arteries of a pre-existing Tartarian transport system. The mud had filled them in during the cataclysm, and the builders were simply the ones who removed the plugs. This realization recontextualizes the entire Industrial Revolution. It wasn't an era of invention, it was an era of excavation. The steam engine was not a breakthrough, it was a simplified, cruder version of the atmospheric power systems that once fueled the canal networks. They traded a clean, silent world for a soot-stained, noisy one, and they called it progress. Ask yourself why the history of technology always moves toward greater complexity and higher cost for the end user. If progress were natural, wouldn't it move towards simplicity and abundance? The transition from the silent, water-based energy of the star forts to the coal-fired boilers of the 19th century was a strategic downgrade. It was a way to put a meter on existence. I followed the trail of the expositions to the southern hemisphere. In Sydney, Australia, sits the Garden Palace, a colossal structure of glass and timber built for the 1879 International Exhibition. It was larger than many European cathedrals, featuring a dome that dominated the skyline. Like its counterparts in Chicago and London, it burned to the ground shortly after the fair ended. The official story says a faulty flue caused the blaze, and conveniently the fire destroyed the 1881 census records and a vast collection of Aboriginal artefacts. Not this accident, not that coincidence, something else. The fires of the 19th century were the ultimate tools of the revisionist. When you find a city you didn't build, and you want to claim it as your own, you must first remove the evidence of the previous tenants. The great fires of Chicago, Boston, Seattle, and Sydney were not tragedies of urban planning. They were controlled demolitions of the Tartarian infrastructure. They burned the wood and the plaster to hide the fact that the foundations were made of a high-tech geopolymer that we still cannot replicate. I found a witness account from the Chicago fire of 1871 that described the stone walls melting like wax and a greenish light that descended from the sky. This is not the behavior of a wood fire. This is the signature of directed energy or a massive electrical discharge. The reset was not just a flood of mud, it was a baptism of fire. They purged the records, levelled the grandest halls, and then built their modern brick and mortar shacks on top of the indestructible foundations. The pattern of erasure extends to the very people we are told discovered these lands. I began to look into the logs of the early explorers, men like Cook, Vancouver, and La Perouse. Their journals are filled with descriptions of ancient ruins and walled cities in the Americas and the Pacific that do not appear in later editions of their works. I found a suppressed map from the 1780s showing a massive star-fortified city on the coast of what is now California, labelled Nova Albion. According to our textbooks, California was a wilderness inhabited by hunter-gatherers until the Spanish missions arrived. Yet, the map shows a sophisticated urban centre with a grid system and a lighthouse that utilised a perpetual flame. Where did this city go? It was scrubbed. It was demapped. The institutional gatekeepers realised that if they admitted to the existence of advanced civilizations in the New World prior to European arrival, the entire justification for colonialism would vanish. So they invented the wilderness myth. They told us the land was empty, so they could justify the theft of the structures that were already there. They turned the Tartarian survivors into Indians or nomads, stripping them of their history and their technology until they were nothing more than characters in a frontier drama. Ask yourself why the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley are treated as a mystery when their earthworks perfectly align with the star-fort geometry found in Eurasia. They weren't different cultures, they were the same culture. A global, maritime, energetic civilization that the modern world has spent 2 centuries trying to bury. The intellectual provocation lies in the standard model of history itself. We are taught that humanity follows a linear path from the cave to the cubicle, but the evidence suggests a cyclical reality. We are currently in a trough, a low vibration era defined by scarcity and control. The Tartarian era was a peak, a time of atmospheric harvesting and harmonic architecture. I found a technical manual from a defunct German university, printed in 1840, that discussed the etheric flux of the atmosphere as a primary driver of mechanical work. Within 10 years, that manual was removed from the curriculum. The word ether was turned into a term of mockery. The institutional gatekeepers, men like Kelvin and Maxwell, were tasked with rewriting the laws of physics to exclude the possibility of free, ambient energy. They gave us the second law of thermodynamics, which dictates that everything must decay, everything must run out. It is a law of scarcity. It is a psychological prison. What if the laws of physics are actually just the rules of the current management? If you can convince a population that energy is finite, you can force them to work for it. If they knew the air itself was a reservoir of power, the entire economic structure of the world would evaporate. This is the unsettling truth. Our poverty is manufactured. Our labour is a choice made by those who rewritten our past. I returned to the basement where I found the first map. I realised it wasn't just a map of geography, it was a map of a lost frequency. The names of the cities, Samarkand, Astrakhan, Tobolsk, were not just locations, they were resonators. I began to plot the coordinates of the destroyed Tartarian capitals on a global grid. When connected, they form a perfect dodecahedron. This isn't the work of disparate tribes. This is the work of a civilization that understood the earth as a living, geometric entity. The institutional erasure has been so thorough that even the alternative historians are often looking in the wrong direction. They look for aliens or gods, when the truth is much more provocative. It was us. We did this. We built the stars. We harvested the air. And then we were betrayed. Not by an outside force, not by a natural disaster, by a small group of opportunists who saw the catastrophe of the mud flood as a chance to become the new gods of a broken world. They are the cartographers who told us the world was empty. They are the architects who told us they built the palaces. They are the teachers who told us we were nothing before they arrived. I am looking at a photograph of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In the background, partially obscured by a hill of excavated dirt, is a stone archway that looks 1,000 years old. The workers are ignoring it, or perhaps they were told not to see it. This is the staccato reality of our lives. We move from one pre-packaged experience to the next, never stopping to look at the seams in the wallpaper. But the seams are everywhere. They are in the Roman ruins of Libya that look identical to the ruins of Peru. They are in the Gothic cathedrals of Russia that share the same proportions as the temples of India. The erasure is failing because the scale of the original world was too vast to fully hide. They can burn the maps, but they can't burn the earth. They can't burn the frequency that still hums in the stones of the star forts. I feel a somber weight as I conclude this part of the investigation, a sense that I am touching something truly forbidden, not because it is dangerous, but because it is liberating. To know the truth about Tartaria is to know that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are the scavengers of a greater age, and the loops remain open. The mud is still there, beneath the asphalt. The energy is still there, in the air. The question is no longer, did they exist? The question is, how do we take it back? The final anomaly I found was in the clocks. I spent a week in an horological museum, looking at the timepieces of the late 18th century. Many of them featured a decimal system, 10 hours in a day, 100 minutes in an hour. It was a brief, failed experiment during the French Revolution, or so we are told, but I found older Tartarian-era clocks that didn't track time as we know it at all. They tracked the rotation of the heavens, the tides, and the atmospheric pressure. They were instruments of alignment, not of scheduling. The standardization of time in the 1880s was the final nail in the coffin of the old world. By forcing the entire planet onto a single, artificial clock, the institutional gatekeepers disconnected us from the natural rhythms of the earth. They turned us into components of the machine. The Great Reset was a synchronization. Every person, every train, every factory, all forced to beat to the same artificial heart. It was the ultimate act of gatekeeping, the ownership of time itself. I stood in the museum and watched the seconds tick away on a modern quartz clock, feeling the profound loss of that older, more fluid way of being. We are living in a countdown, not to progress, not to the future. Something else. The tension of this investigation is the tension of an impending realization. I have shown you the maps. I have shown you the mud. I have shown you the star forts and the orphan trains. I have invited you to look at the Stafford buildings and the temporary cities. Now I ask you to look at yourself. Why is it so hard to believe? Why does the mind recoil from the idea that our history is a fabrication? It is because the lie is the foundation of our identity. If the maps are wrong, then our borders are wrong. If the timeline is wrong, then our achievements are fake. It is a somber, terrifying prospect. But it is also the only path to a genuine future. We are the descendants of the survivors, and we carry the blueprints of the old world in our DNA. The institutional gatekeepers know this. That is why they are so desperate to keep us distracted, to keep us arguing over the crumbs of the narrative they provided. They are afraid of the moment we stop looking at the map they gave us and start looking at the ground beneath our feet. I will stop here. I have laid out the pattern. The global architecture, the erased empires, the buried windows, and the stolen energy. The investigation is now yours as much as mine. The evidence is not in some far-off archive. It is in your own city, in your own history books, in the very air you breathe. The skeptics will call this a conspiracy, a word invented by the gatekeepers to silence the inquisitive. But conspiracy is just another word for a plan made in secret. And what could be more secret than the removal of 1 billion people from the record of time? What if the unresolved philosophical open loop is not about the past at all? What if it is about the moment you decide to wake up? The narrative is crumbling. The ink is fading. The true map is beginning to show through the parchment. What will you do when you see it? What will you do when you realize that the world you were told to inhabit is just a shadow of the one you actually belong to? Ask yourself. What if everything you know is a placeholder, not the truth, not a lie, something else? I turned my gaze toward the heavens, specifically the great glass of the 17th century. We are told that telescopes were the clumsy inventions of Galilean pioneers, yet the optics found in the forgotten observatories of the Tartarian hinterlands suggest a different mastery. I found an account of a lens grinder in 1702 who produced a glass so pure it could resolve the moons of Jupiter in colour, a feat officially impossible until the advent of the modern apochromatic lens. This was not progress, this was a peak. The institutional gatekeepers of the Victorian era did not improve upon this technology. They simplified it, moving from crystal-based optics to cheaper, distorted glass that required massive frames to maintain focus. Ask yourself why the old observatories resemble temples, with their copper domes and precise alignment to magnetic ley lines. They were not merely looking at the stars, they were interacting with them. In the ruins of a library in St. Petersburg, I discovered a series of celestial charts, where the stars were not depicted as distant gas giants, but as frequency nodes. The maps showed a connection between the terrestrial star forts and the celestial bodies above, a literal as above, so below engineering project on a planetary scale. This is the erasure trope in its most expansive form. The removal of our cosmic context. They didn't just hide a kingdom on Earth. They hid our relationship with the firmament. They told us the stars were unreachable, dead things, to ensure we never tried to re-establish the link. The investigation then forced me to confront the concept of the Great Mud. If the 19th century began with a global inundation, we must look for the source. I studied the clay deserts of the American West and the massive unnatural silt deposits of the Caspian Basin. These are not the results of millions of years of erosion. These are the leftovers of a high-pressure slurry. I found a technical paper from an 1840s mining engineer who noted that the soil in the Midwest felt processed, as if it had been tumbled in a massive industrial centrifuge. What if the mud flood was not an act of God, but an act of war? A liquefaction event triggered by the collapse of the very energy grid I had been tracking. If the star forts were stabilizers, their sudden deactivation would have turned the crust of the earth into a fluid. Buildings didn't just sink, the ground rose to meet them. I looked at the load distribution of the old world's cathedrals and found that their foundations are often twice as deep as necessary for their weight. It is as if they were built to withstand a shifting liquid earth. The institutional gatekeepers call these deep foundations a sign of architectural genius. I call them a survival strategy. The Great Reset was a terraforming event. They washed away the old world's population with a deluge of liquid earth, then moved in to claim the virgin territory once the surface had hardened. I began to track the institutional erasure through the lens of language. In the early 1800s, there was a sudden, violent push for the standardization of national tongues. In France, the regional dialects were suppressed. In the Americas, the native languages were systematically dismantled in boarding schools. Why this obsession with a singular, controlled vocabulary? Because language is the operating system of the mind. If you can remove the words for atmospheric energy or etheric resonance from the common parlance, you make the concepts themselves unthinkable. I found a dictionary from 1760 that contained over 50 terms for different types of luminiferous air. By 1850, those terms had vanished, replaced by the monolithic and sterile word gas. Not an evolution, not a simplification, a lobotomy. The cartographers who removed Tartaria from the maps were working in tandem with the philologists who removed the power from our speech. They wanted a population that could only describe the world in terms of labour and cost. They wanted a people who could see a copper-domed power station and only have the words to call it a church. The sombre reality of the orphanage system became even clearer when I looked at the architecture of the schools themselves. Across the United States and Europe, the late 19th century saw the rise of the industrial school, massive brick complexes with barred windows and rigid military-style schedules. These were the factories where the new narrative was forged. I found a curriculum guide from 1888 that explicitly forbade the teaching of history prior to the American Revolution in anything but the most mythological terms. The children were taught that the world was a dark, primitive place before the light of the steam engine arrived. They were taught to fear the old buildings as places of superstition. This is how you hide a civilization. You make the heirs ashamed of their inheritance. You tell the children that the palaces they are living in were built by their primitive ancestors as a way to honor a sky god, rather than as a way to power a world. It is a psychological coup d'etat. The founding fathers weren't building a new nation, they were managing a planetary estate for an absentee landlord whose name they had already erased. I shifted my focus to the metallurgy of the 19th century. In the basement of a demolished foundry in Pennsylvania, I found a sample of old world iron. It was rust-resistant, high-carbon steel that shouldn't have existed before the Bessemer process, yet it was taken from a bridge foundation dated to 1790. When I asked a modern metallurgist to analyze it, he was baffled. "The molecular structure is too uniform," he said. "It looks like it was grown, not cast." This is the recurring pattern. The deeper you dig into the pre-industrial era, the more advanced the industry becomes. The Iron Age and the Bronze Age are labels used by the institutional gatekeepers to create a false sense of linear progress. In reality, the Tartarian world was a world of advanced polymers and biomimetics. We are told they used horses because they didn't have cars. What if they didn't have cars because they didn't need them? What if their transport was based on frequency and magnetic levitation, leaving no tracks, no soot, and no environmental scar? The paved roads we find buried under the mud weren't for carriages. They were for something else, something silent, something that didn't require a gas station every 50 miles. The sense of forbidden knowledge grew as I investigated the Great Survey of the 1840s. Every major power, Britain, Russia, the United States, simultaneously launched massive geographical surveys of their territories. On the surface, it was about borders. Beneath the surface, it was a scavenger hunt. They were looking for the nodes. They were looking for the star forts that hadn't been buried, the towers that still hummed, and the libraries that hadn't been burned. I found a dispatch from a British officer in India who reported finding a mountain of glass that broadcast music when the sun hit it. He was told to level it with explosives. This is the revisionist method. If you can't understand it, or if you can't tax it, you destroy it. The 1840s was the decade the New World Order officially took possession of the planetary grid. They mapped the remaining energy points and built their capitals directly on top of them. London, Paris, DC, Moscow. They are all situated on the primary ley lines of the old Tartarian system. They are sitting on the throne, wearing the crown, and telling us they made the gold themselves. I spent a month in the subterranean archives of a city in the Midwest, looking at Sanborn maps from the late 1800s. These are highly detailed fire insurance maps. In several of them, I found entire blocks labelled as remains of ancient masonry or unidentified stoneworks. These maps were produced for insurance companies, the most cold-blooded, realistic entities on Earth. They didn't care about the historical narrative, they cared about the risk. And they knew that the new cities were being built on top of old stone that was harder than granite and twice as heavy. Ask yourself why a city like St. Louis would have massive subterranean stone vaults that predated the arrival of the first settlers. Ask yourself why the mounds of the region were found to contain copper pipes and glazed pottery. The institutional gatekeepers call them out-of-place artifacts. I call them the plumbing of a global empire. We are literally living on top of the carcass of a giant, and we are told the bumps in the ground are just natural formations. The tone of the world began to feel more and more like a stage play. I looked at the great statues of the 19th century, the massive bronze and stone figures that appear in every capital. They tell us these are heroes and statesmen, but look at their proportions, look at their dress. Many of them are depicted in Roman togas, holding scrolls or rods of power that look suspiciously like antennas. Are they statues of the men who built the cities, or are they the captured icons of the previous civilization, renamed to fit the new story? In a museum in Prague, I found a statue that had been rebranded 3 times in 200 years. First, it was a king of the East. Then it was a saint of the church. Finally, it was a pioneer of science. The stone didn't change. The nameplate did. This is the institutional gatekeeping in action, the recycling of the past to legitimize the present. They don't have their own culture, so they wear the clothes of the one they murdered. I am haunted by the unresolved philosophical open loop of the energy. If the world was once powered by the ether, and if that power was free, then the very concept of value has been distorted for centuries. We have been trained to equate energy with cost and cost with survival. This is the ultimate institutional erasure, the erasure of human freedom. The Great Reset was not just a geological event, it was a spiritual one. It was the moment we were moved from a world of abundance to a world of artificial scarcity. I look at the power lines draped across the beautiful, arched windows of our old cities, and I see a cage. I see the tethers that keep us bound to a system that doesn't want us to look up. Not this grid, not that bill, something else. The tension remains. The investigation continues. I found a final map. It was a projection of the world as it appears from above the North Pole. In this version, the continents are not isolated islands, but part of a continuous ring of land surrounding a central magnetic source. On this map, Tartaria is not a country, it is a gateway. It is the region that connects the inner world to the outer world. The institutional gatekeepers have spent centuries telling us the poles are frozen, uninhabitable wastes. But what if they are the primary nodes of the entire planetary circuit? What if the Great Reset was an attempt to block our access to the centre? Ask yourself why every major nation signed the Antarctic Treaty, forbidding independent exploration. Ask yourself what they are guarding. The investigation has led me to the edge of the known world, and I find that the map is still being drawn. The cartographers are still at work, blurring the lines, hiding the land, and keeping us trapped in a narrative that is as thin as the paper it's printed on. What if the unresolved loop is that the empire never truly fell? What if it was just hidden, and we are the ones who were removed? I found myself drawn to the silent industry of the 1840s, specifically the massive stone mills of New England and Northern Europe. We are told these were the birthplaces of the textile revolution, powered by water wheels and primitive gears. But look at the architecture. These are not factories, they are cathedrals of production. They feature ornate brickwork, rose windows, and high-reaching spires that resemble the atmospheric antennas of the Eurasian steppe. I found a blueprint for a mill in Lowell, Massachusetts that included a series of copper-lined conduits running through the foundation, far removed from any water source. The official narrative says these were for ventilation. Ask yourself why ventilation requires a metal conductive lining. What if these mills were not pulling power from the river, but from the very air? The water was not the fuel, it was the coolant for a massive subterranean electrical discharge. This is the institutional gatekeeping of the industrial age. They took a decentralized atmospheric energy system and slapped a water wheel on the side of it to explain away the movement of the looms. They didn't want us to know that the stones themselves were vibrating with power. They wanted us to believe that labor was the only source of value. The investigation into the Great Reset led me to the strange phenomenon of the World's Fairs architecture once more, but this time I focused on the statues. In the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Statue of the Republic stood 65 feet tall, covered in gold leaf, and holding a staff that looked remarkably like a modern Wardenclyffe tower. Within months of the fair's closing, this temporary masterpiece was mysteriously burned. Not a loss of art, not a tragic fire, something else. It was the liquidation of a giant. I discovered a series of photographs from the late 19th century showing colossal statues being dismantled in cities across the globe. These were not modern creations. They were the weathered, eroded remains of a pre-cataclysmic world. The New World authorities didn't build them. They inherited them and then claimed they were made of plaster to justify their destruction. If you can convince the public that a 60-foot golden goddess is just a temporary prop made of staff and hemp, they won't complain when you haul it away to be melted down for the new state currency. It is a global salvage operation disguised as a celebration of progress. I began to look at the star forts from a geological perspective. In many cases, these bastions are not built on top of the earth, but are carved directly into the bedrock. I visited a site in the Ohio River Valley where a fort had been partially excavated. The stone was not local. It was a high-density basalt that matched the composition of the Himalayan foothills. How did millions of tons of Asian basalt end up in the American Midwest before the age of steam? The institutional gatekeepers call it glacial erratic. I call it the evidence of a global transport system that defied our understanding of physics. Ask yourself why every star fort is located on a primary telluric line, the natural electrical circuits of the Earth. They were the voltage regulators of a planetary grid. When the mud flood hit, these regulators were short-circuited. The liquefaction of the soil was the result of a massive global electrical surge that turned the Earth's crust into a roiling sea of clay. The survivors didn't just find buried buildings, they found a planet that had been digitally rebooted, and they were the only ones who knew how to operate the leftover hardware. The narrative of the pioneers began to fall apart when I studied the railroads. We are told the muscle transcontinental railroad was a feat of grueling manual labour, yet the speed at which the tracks were laid defies the logistics of the 1860s. I found a diary from a surveyor who claimed they were uncovering tracks as much as they were laying them. He wrote of finding iron rails already embedded in the sediment, perfectly levelled and aligned out, stretching for miles across the untouched wilderness. The great rail boom was actually a great reclamation. They were clearing the mud off the old Tartarian maglev lines and replacing the sophisticated carriages with crude coal-burning locomotives. It was a technological regression sold as a breakthrough. They took a high-speed, silent transit network and turned it into a slow, rattling, profitable monopoly. This is the core of the erasure. They took our inheritance and sold it back to us at a premium, then told us we should be grateful for the invention. I turned my attention to the asylums of the 19th century once more. I discovered that many of these institutions were built with hydrotherapy wings that utilized complex, high-pressure water systems and massive copper vats. The official history says these were for calming the insane. But look at the schematics. These are electrolytic cells. They are systems for separating hydrogen from water. They weren't washing the patients. They were using the patients as a labour force to maintain a rudimentary form of fuel cell power for the local elite. The insane were often just the intellectuals and the engineers who refused to accept the new narrative, the ones who knew how the old world worked. By labelling them mad, the institutional gatekeepers could legally seize their knowledge and keep them imprisoned in the very power plants they were forced to operate. It is a sombre, terrifying cycle of exploitation. They didn't just steal the past, they enslaved the people who remembered it. The investigation of the Great Reset led me to the concept of historical anchoring. I found a document from a private meeting of the Royal Geographical Society in 1874 where they discussed the need to anchor the timeline by creating a series of artificial historical markers. This is why we have so many centennial celebrations and jubilees in the late 19th century. They were creating a false sense of longevity. They took the ruins of the Tartarian cities and slapped established 1850 signs on them. They invented founding myths for cities that had been standing for 1,000 years. I found a photograph of a building in Salt Lake City that shows a fully weathered, ancient-looking facade being covered in a new layer of Victorian brick. It was a literal whitewashing of history. The pioneers weren't building. They were decorating the tombs of their predecessors. I began to look at the flags of the world. In the 18th century, the flag of Tartaria, a black griffin on a yellow field, appeared in every major naval atlas. By 1820, it had vanished. It was replaced by the Union Jack, the tricolor, and the stars and stripes. Ask yourself how a global empire with a recognized flag could simply cease to exist without a single recorded war or treaty of surrender. The Napoleonic Wars were not a conflict between European nations. They were a coordinated global campaign to dismantle the Tartarian administrative hubs. Napoleon wasn't trying to conquer Europe. He was a liquidator sent to seize the archives and the treasuries of the old world. This is why his armies targeted libraries and administrative centres. They weren't looking for territory. They were looking for the deeds to the world. And once they had them, they rewrote the history to make it look like they had earned it through blood and glory rather than through a systematic corporate takeover. The unresolved philosophical open loop shifted towards the idea of frequency control. If the old world was based on harmony and resonance, the new world is based on dissonance and noise. I looked at the standard pitch of music, which was shifted in the 19th century from a natural 432 Hz to a sterile 440 Hz. This wasn't a random choice. It was a deliberate attempt to disconnect the human nervous system from the natural frequencies of the earth. The Tartarian world understood that sound is a creative force that you can build or destroy with a whisper if you have the right frequency. The institutional gatekeepers took that power away by flooding our world with noise. The noise of engines, the noise of factories, and the noise of a dissonant musical scale. They turned our resonance into interference. We are living in a state of perpetual low-level anxiety because we are vibrating out of sync with the planet. I found a final set of maps in the private collection of a deceased diplomat. They weren't maps of land, but maps of aura. They showed the Earth as a series of interlocking energy fields, with the star forts acting as the valves. On these maps, the city of Moscow was labelled as the heart of the North, and Washington, D.C. was the crown of the West. The maps were dated 1812, the same year both cities were mysteriously burned. The Great Fires were not about destroying buildings. They were about destroying the aura of the Earth. They were ritualistic acts of energy bleeding, designed to weaken the planetary grid so the new gatekeepers could install their own artificial system of control. Not this fire, not that war, something else. I am left standing in the centre of a modern metropolis, looking at the grid-locked streets and the grey, utilitarian skyscrapers. I feel the sombre weight of the reset more than ever. We are living in a world that has been tuned to the frequency of survival, while the world of abundance lies just a few inches beneath the mud. The investigation is no longer about finding facts. It is about reclaiming a state of mind. The cartographers are still among us, drawing the lines of our reality every day in the news, in the schools, and on our screens. But they cannot stop the hum. The earth is beginning to vibrate again. The star forts are beginning to wake up, and the loop is closing. The question is, when the old frequency returns, will you be ready to hear it, or will you be lost in the noise of the narrative? The investigation has no end. Only a new beginning. I looked at the clocks one last time. They are ticking faster now, not because time is speeding up, but because the artificial standard time is losing its grip on the planet. The Great Reset is reaching its expiration date. The mud is drying out, and the ruins are beginning to speak. I see it in the eyes of the people I meet, the same inquisitive spark that led me to that first basement. We are the ones who were told to forget, but we are also the ones who are starting to remember. The forbidden knowledge is no longer a secret, it is a resonance. And once you catch the tune, you can never go back to the silence. Ask yourself, what if the empire isn't gone? What if it's just waiting for us to stop believing in its absence? The unresolved loop is the only thing that keeps the world turning. What if you are the one who finally closes it?